Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How Tape is Shaping Our Digital Future Today. I'm Bob Cohn, Director of Product Enablement, and joining me is Matt Ninesling, Senior Director of Tape Portfolio Solutions. Mr. Ninesling, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Bob.
And
Glad
I
to be
guess
here.
good afternoon to some of those of you who are joining us from different time zones. We have got a great conversation lined up for you today, and we hope you'll be a part of that conversation. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to enter in any questions you might have, comments, concerns as we go along. We're going to keep our conversation down to about 30 minutes today. So feel free to write those questions in as we go, and time allowing, we'll get to them at the end. Uh, the chat is a one-way function today, so don't use that to send in questions. If we've got links or information that we'll be supplying during the webinar, we'll drop that in the chat function. So again, look at that Q&A. From the title, you might think that this is all about tape, but really I would say this is more about the digital world in general. And it's getting harder to differentiate the different pieces and parts of the digital world because, as we would hope, they become so tightly integrated. And that's an integrated world that we've seen change quite a bit lately, from the advent of cloud changing the way we do things and sometimes where we do things, Flash coming in and having a really big impact on storage and tiered storage and which tiers function in what capacity. We have seen major advances in compute, which have led to things such as artificial intelligence, quite the buzz out there today. As a matter of fact, I'm a little bit worried that the next webinar you tune into will be run by an avatar, and both Matt and I will be out of jobs. Seemingly, tape has been sitting on the sidelines as all of this has been going on, but I would really argue that's not the case at all. It's the advances in technology we've seen throughout the digital world that are also applying to tape. And that's where we want to start the conversation today, is how those technological innovations have really changed where tape is contributing, and how tape is not just a part of the digital world, but is helping to lead the storage revolution that we see in modern compute. So we'll talk about some of those technological innovations. Then we'll follow that with some of the use cases and roles in which tape is leading, and end with some interesting industry trends that we think are worth keeping an eye on. So with that being said, Matt, are you ready to jump into it?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, let's do this thing. I want to start with what I'm going to call the trifecta of technology. And the first thing in that trifecta is S3 and the S3 interface. I think this protocol is kind of the magic sauce, if you will, that makes everything we're going to talk about today possible. So, and Matt, would you say a few words about S3 and how that runs as a protocol for object storage, and give us a little background there?
Yeah, and I think if you look back, everything used to be files in large directory structures and this hierarchy of all these files that you'd have to manage and keep track of. Well, really, when cloud got started is where we started to see object storage, and an S3 interface was created. That S3 interface or protocol is really designed for lots of unstructured data storage in large files and ease of moving that data around without having to keep that structure of a file system. And it works really well, and it actually works really well with tape as part of that tier, with if as long as you just provide that same interface to the tape system as part of the archive.
So really, when we think about this S3 interface, it's interesting because it gives us object storage, and now we're talking about object storage versus tape storage or disk storage or cloud storage. Is that fair? We're just talking about
It's really
storage in
just
general.
object storage, right? It's just you can use any of those tiers. Just like in the past, you could use different storage technologies with a file system or ways to share other information or store it. Now we're just saying object storage. It doesn't matter what the underlying disk drive, flash, tape, whatever that is below it. It's really just providing the right interface to that storage and having it look like that tier and providing the right SLA for that type of storage that you're using.
So you mentioned SLAs, and I think that's an important point here. If we're looking at a universal interface, then on the backside, really the question is about service level agreements, cost of the storage, what you're trying to accomplish, recovery time objective, recovery point objective, and we're going to cover all of that as we go. So what would you say then with this interface now available to tape, as it is in many different solutions? What would you say as we combine that with a new and more open format, LTFS? And I should say LTFS is not a new format, but when you combine how the information is stored on tape with the interface to tape and this open interface, what does that bias or give us?
Well, it actually gives you quite a bit. So LTFS, or linear tape file system, it creates self-describing tapes. So when you write a tape using LTFS, there's actually a header in the file system on the front of the tape that says, here's what all the files are and here's what's in that tape. So you could take that tape and put it in any tape drive connected to any application that knows how to talk LTFS, and you could understand what the data is on that tape, and you could read it back and use it. So it really gets you to the point where there's no tie, there's no proprietary format or tie to a certain, any kind of vendor lock-in. You could move that tape from one system to another, and as long as it is the standard LTFS format, it's readable by any of those different applications that want to use it.
I've heard you use the term future proofing. Obviously, when we're talking about storage today, the new storage retention period is basically forever. We find so much value in data and extracting value from that data. So if we're going to hold data forever, how does LTFS help us in future proofing for migration?
Well, I think some of that is when everyone chooses a vendor or storage format to use, they go out and they base that on price and availability and relationships and everything else. You could find out 10 years from now that it's not the right, format to be using. But if it is a proprietary format, now you have to use that either forever, or you have to do a full migration where you're going to read everything back and write it out again in some other format. With LTFS, you could easily migrate from one application to another application. It also allows for kind of automated migrations in the background, as long as that LTFS appliance above it, or the software application, understands what that data is. It can look at that tape, know what's on it, and rewrite it to another tape without a lot of other system overhead being used.
Great. So two of the things that I think were somewhat challenging with tape in the past is how we're going to communicate with tape. A lot of applications didn't understand tape. Applications understand S3. Now that gives us a transparent interface in. And then when it comes to moving from one generation of tape to the next generation, as we anticipate we will do, we see that that's been moved by the LTFS format. The final piece in this trifecta I want to talk about is Ethernet, and an Ethernet interface for tape versus fiber channel. How do you see that changing the playing field?
Well, today there are multiple ways that you could add, like a bridge product, something like that, to a tape system so that you have an Ethernet interface to tape. The benefit really is that if you look at a modern data center, everything is pretty much moved to an Ethernet interconnect. So it's that converged network that everything is connected over Ethernet. You may still have some fiber channel, which historically really is the way that most tape systems have been connected, and it works great. And a fiber channel SAN is a very bulletproof way to connect up that storage tier. But if you wanted to move away from that and have everything on that same infrastructure that you have with Ethernet, you now can. So now you can have, an object storage with tape. So it's the same storage, protocol that's used everywhere with object storage. You can have LTFS, and you can have an Ethernet connection to that tape system, so that it's really on all the exact same technology platforms that you're using for all of the other storage within your ecosystem.
Great. So with that trifecta of technology, let's jump in to the fun stuff. Let's talk about how this has really opened up some of the use cases for tape. I want to start with AI. That's an interesting one. If you look at something like ChatGPT that came out less than a year ago, I believe it was the end of 2022, around November, when ChatGPT was first introduced, it accumulated 1 million users in the first 5 days. Within a couple of months, that had increased to over 100 million users. Literally the fastest growing application that's ever been introduced. So that's really a big one. And when we talk about AI, I think we really need to remember that we're also talking about the data that drives AI. Here we say the vision for AI will require tape access. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
I think the main theme there is not just that it requires tape access, it's that it requires a lot of data. So
Hmm.
the more data you have to feed into, a learning model, the better output you're going to get. And so you need a very large data lake, and you want to also then keep that output so that you can run that with newer algorithms in the future. So you're keeping a lot of data so that you can refine that and get better and better outcomes from those learning algorithms as you move forward. I think that we used to think about a common theme was really the line between what can be kept and what's economical to keep from a data
Right.
perspective. And, tape really kind of removes that line. If you add that tier that's very, very economical, now you can say, I'm going to keep all of this and I'm going to use it in the future in ways that I don't know that its value is today.
Yeah, and I think that's really an important aspect here because some of the data that we would have deemed extraneous, really, really not considered necessary to our business model, now that data can have a big play in AI. And if you look at where this is showing up, it's literally everywhere. And so those information archives become more and more important. We've got some of the different types of large learning or large language models showing up here. What are some of your thoughts, Matt, on where this plays in as how people are using AI or pulling data, or what is or isn't important?
I think some interesting examples here, and this shows it's being used across all industries, and that's
Hmm.
that's it's not just ChatGPT. It's not somebody trying to fill out an essay or something like that, right? It's being used
Right.
to learn about lots of different things. From you look at like autonomous vehicles, right? And there's a lot of sensor data that's brought back from radar, lidar, GPS, all these different things that are used in an autonomous vehicle. One interesting thing about that data is that those are point in time data. So that car is doing something using a certain algorithm on a certain day with temperatures and sunlight and everything in its exact way that you probably can't recreate that. So that kind of sensor data also is important because it's not something that you just go generate, right? It is a point in time data during a certain thing happening. You could say the same with weather algorithms that are, for forecasting that they're starting to use more and more AI in. Um, and then there's also just the fact that a lot of this is information that you may not be able to get back. So you want to keep it forever. And tape really is a great place to do that, not knowing how you can use it in the future, but knowing that there's a pretty high likelihood that you're going to want to.
So we looked at three maybe use cases for tape here. One is when you have these language models or learning models that need ingest. So obviously we've got to have access the data to ingest in, getting that from lifetime archives that are on tape. Then the second, once you've created some type of algorithm or output or created a model for predictive or analytical uses, you've got to save those new models and recover them if anything happens to them. And I think then the third case is for legal purposes. And that is when you're thinking about, you mentioned autonomous driving. If there is some kind of legal case against an automobile manufacturer, you can think of the chain of command of every step of the development of that product or any solution that we have out there and being able to show where this data has been built and come from. So all of those really bode for that forever data. And it really talks about data that today is pretty much in your archives already. This was an interesting study that was done by IDC, and they went out and asked of those already using artificial information or model language learning, machine learning services, what type of data are you feeding into them? And it really kind of caught me by surprise because as you mentioned, Matt, when I brought up Chat GPT, those are the things that get the headlines or, excuse me, social media. But when you look at this, really the biggest groups of data are the typical data that we find in our data centers, transactional data, master data, streaming data. It just goes on and on. And all of that today is sitting on tape libraries. Where do you see people incorporating this, Matt, and bringing it in specifically in this case for AI?
Right, and to your point, Bob, it's not just that it is sitting on tape libraries. It's that historically, it's always that has been your backup or that has been your archive, right? So it's been on. You have this huge data lake or this huge amount of data that you've stored for years. Well, now how do you monetize that, or how do you bring that back in and understand trends? Buying trends. Say if you're a retailer, and what things go on, sale, what season. There's lots of ways that you could plug in things like spatial data, mapping, that kind of stuff to understand environmental differences over time. And then just all the business to business exchanges, companies are going to use that to understand how to make a lot of efficiencies if they can model it with some of these newer algorithms that are out there today that weren't there a decade ago. But having that data available makes that all possible.
And the trick is having it available, meaning you can access it. And that's where this S3 interface and LTFS and Ethernet connectivity, these are the things that are making that possible. If we look at a quick use case here from Edinburgh Information Data Facility, this is an example of where they have got tens of petabytes, literally 50 petabytes sitting on tape that can be pulled into machine learning, back out to the archive, back into machine learning. That's the way we're starting to see tape used. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, this is a great example because it really, they've created this, these pieces of hardware, connected them all together, and they're using very fast memory, SSDs, GPUs, flash, and then a hard drive tier connected to a large HSM with DMF that allows them to pull data on and off of that archive from tape. But they give researchers the opportunity to really use these cutting edge resources to go out and use very strong machine learning algorithms to look at science in different ways that they never could have before. The other good thing to notice in this example, which is a really good real world use case, is that you'd said 50 petabytes. They only have about 20 to 24 petabytes of data on tape, which is still a lot, but it's dual copy. So that second set is in a separate location that's set up for DR because they understand the value of that archive. So they have a full dual copy. If anything ever happened on that primary set of data, they'd be able to access it again because it's all stored somewhere else that's not in the same facility. So that's almost a perfect example of the best, kind of real world use case and best practices for this kind of an environment where you've got long-term retention in mind.
Yeah, and if it's a very interesting use case. If you'd like to see more of this, we've asked Katie Jones to drop a link in the chat that talks about how this is being implemented. A very interesting article written up there. There's also, of course, a use case on spectralogic.com that we'll look at. So tape in action with AI actually extending the world of storage. Let's talk about that second use case now, and that is cloud. This is really an interesting one. Matt, what are you seeing with tape and cloud today? Because that's been a conversation for a while.
Yep. Well, I think the first thing that you really have to look at is that, the cloud came out and it got a lot of press, and it is an amazing tool if you use it in the right way. But the other thing that you have to recognize is that the cloud uses a lot of tape. So if you look at those much lower cost tiers in the cloud, those are tape. So really your decision is not whether I use tape versus cloud. It's, do I want to manage my own equipment, or do I want to pay someone else, sometimes, 3x the same amount of money to manage it for me? And there's other benefits that you might have for owning your own capital assets. But the first one is really just knowing that you're using the same storage technologies. You're using flash, you're using disk drives, you're using tape when you use cloud. It's just not sitting on your floor.
Right. So I think that's The big question is, do you want to manage it or do you want someone else managing it for you? And when you think about the cost, up to 300% greater cost to store information in cloud. And we're going to talk about some of these breakdowns, but we've got a very interesting calculator and a lot of information on how this plays out that will drop another link to our website to give you a little bit more information. When it comes to managing this data over time, Matt, what would you say about that cost on-site versus on-prem versus hybrid, where some is in the cloud and some is on-prem?
Well, we have some calculators that really do show that, and we actually have a couple slides down further on where we're going to show kind of what different tiers of the cloud compare to tape. But you can use that as a best of both worlds kind of scenario if you want to. It makes a lot of sense in some cases to keep a DR copy in the cloud and have a copy of that data that's up in the cloud that it's off premise. If an actual natural disaster happened, it would be safe from any of that. But then have a copy on premise using the same kind of interfaces and technologies as you would to the cloud. So your applications are all the same, but host it yourself and use that as the copy that you access data from, so that you're getting kind of the lowest cost with the most protection and the best ease of use.
Is it fair to say that cloud has actually taught us how to archive information?
It's taught us better ways to archive information for sure. So like we talked about with S3 and LTFS and then object storage tiering, the cloud did that really well, and it did it at scale, and it introduced a lot of technologies that made that more and more efficient. Now you can use those same technologies, but you don't have to just use them in someone else's cloud.
Gotcha. When we put this together, when we look at how information is archived in the cloud, and the fact that when you go to get information out of the cloud, you've got some delay before that's staged back, it seems like working between the two and having cloud archive as well as on-prem archive or an on-prem Glacier is an opportunity that's really hard to miss. For people that are looking at this or customers who are looking at this, Matt, what would you suggest in getting into this approach to on-prem Glacier archiving?
Yeah, the benefit there is that you can do on-premise Glacier. You can have on-site resources, disk, tape that appear just as Glacier appears. So that's why you call it on-prem Glacier, right? But from the application standpoint, it doesn't look any different than if you were using a Glacier tier in AWS or a cold tier in Azure or any of the other cloud providers. But now it's on premise and you can use it. You can access that data. There's no egress charges. You could still keep a copy in the cloud. You could have a landing zone in the cloud for sharing, but then you keep your archive copy on site and you can access it whenever possible. So it really gives you that opportunity to use all of those new technologies in the best way possible, not getting just stuck with one of them.
So it kind of comes to a why wouldn't you sort of conversation. Why wouldn't you investigate on-prem Glacier in addition to any cloud or Glacier work you're doing? And again, it could be hybrid or it could be processing in the cloud, long-term storage on-prem. There are a lot of reasons, and I think we've got yet another link that will take you to more information on the top 8 reasons to consider an on-prem Glacier. We talked a little bit about ROI and the cost, but I think this really sets us up for the rest of our conversation when we talk about tape as the role it plays in resilience. Data governance, data sovereignty, in instances where you absolutely have to own the data versus renting it in a space. And I think one of the biggest ones is ransomware resiliency, because that's something that we've just cannot escape on almost a weekly basis. We hear more stories, and that's been a big one out there. Matt, I think you were the one that originally brought to my attention this attack on Cloud Nordic. What can you tell us about that?
And this was a crazy example that happened a month ago or so. Cloud Nordic is a cloud provider and a Danish cloud provider, and they got hit with ransomware. And then they didn't know it, but they moved some servers between data centers, and that infected another data center, and they lost everything. Everything got got encrypted and they had no access to any data, and none of their customers had access to any of their data. So, the cloud, regardless of how many nines you have, really the only way to truly protect against any kind of an attack is air gap. And that's that one thing tape provides that nothing else does for a truly, resilient system from any kind of an attack that might hit you.
Yeah, and this is an instance where they had multiple layers of backup, but
Yeah.
all of the backups were online. They were all
Right.
accessible. Their primary, their secondary, and it went through it all, and data was lost forever. So one
It's
of
a
the
worst case scenario, right? But
it's a
it can
worst case
happen. I mean,
scenario.
go Google it, and it's a crazy example of how bad it can get.
Yeah, it's one that happened just a month ago, so it's still very current. One of the adages that I think we should live by, and I've heard this said before, is where you store your data does not alleviate your responsibility for the data, and that's a big one
Yeah.
that I think that we have to take
Yeah.
home. And even if you are trying to have a copy in the cloud, and there are many ways that the cloud can protect your data with erasure coding, with multiple copies in the cloud. If you lose data and you have to access it, say a few things about what that looks like, Matt.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're paying to keep that DR copy in the cloud and you have to use it, you paid for some SLA. And if it's on a deep tier of storage in the cloud, you've probably got a 12 to 48 hour time period before you even start getting it back. Once you hit the button to say I need that. If you're a business, you've probably got a small to medium sized business. You're probably at about 2.5 gig a second internet is what you're paying for. You can only use 50, 60, 70% of that to access cloud. So the rest of your business has to keep working, your, internal, external communications, website, all that stuff. So you can only apply, maybe at most 2 gig to get stuff back from the cloud. That's equivalent to 4 LTO9 tape drives in a tape library. So very minimal resources. And with the tape system, if you ever need more, you can add, more tape drives the next day and double, triple, quadruple that throughput very, very quickly if you needed to.
Gotcha. And that all comes at a pretty good cost for that Ethernet access, correct?
So even at that kind of throughput, for Ethernet, for an internet subscriber, you're paying probably $75,000 a year. You can buy a lot faster dedicated connections, but now you're talking, $150,000, $250,000 a year just for the internet connection. Never mind egress fees, cloud storage costs, all that other stuff.
And it's not just accessibility, it's reliability, correct?
Yeah. And tape, LTO9 is 1 times 10 to the 20th for an uncorrectable bit error. That's 5 orders of magnitude better than a disk drive. And, we've got this up here where it's, it's 1 incorrect bit in every 11.4 million petabytes written. On top of that, you could then go to a second copy. That gives you, pretty much you're never going to lose data. And this really protects against things like human error, somebody losing a tape being moved out of the library, somebody inadvertently writing data over something that's on a tape. You do that second copy and either keep it in a tape library somewhere else or export it and put it in a vault somewhere. You're almost guaranteed to never have any kind of data loss. It's very, very resilient at that point.
Beautiful. Let's talk about some of the trends we see in the industry. What about innovation around tape as far as the things we normally think of, capacity, performance, things of that nature?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look, TS1170 just got released as the latest enterprise tape drive. That's 50 terabytes on a single cartridge. The LTO roadmap goes all the way out to LTO 14, where you're at, 576 terabytes on a single cartridge. And there's lots of lab demonstrations where with this kind of technology, we can get to a petabyte cartridge someday in the future. So tape has a very, very long roadmap that's been very consistent up until now. So there's nothing saying that it's not going to hit these kind of capacities, every 2.5 to 3.5 to 4 years out into the future.
And one of the things, and I think we would call this a trend that continues, is some of the basics we know about tape. We've mentioned this in cost. Comparatively, what does it look like?
So this shows, cost per terabyte over 5 years. So if you store 1 terabyte for 5 years, this is kind of what it would cost at different tiers. You can see that standard, high speed cloud tier, you're at $1,300. On-premise NAS, you're about $350 a terabyte. With a tape library, with all in library support, media, everything, you're at about $40 a terabyte. And then that second copy is only almost also going down, to about $5 to $7 a terabyte for an individual cartridge. So it blows everything out of the water from a cost perspective. And over time, this is consistent. This shows LTO-8 cost per terabyte over time. Tape consistently drops in cost, and that's also different than all these other storage technologies. So if you were on LTO-8, you've seen a huge price decrease over the 6 years that technology's been out on the market. And the same thing, the alternate curve is showing with every generation how much more capacity you get from every new cartridge. So that really is kind of an ideal scenario for any storage technology: lower and lower price and higher capacity, consistently over 20 plus years of time.
It also seems like energy efficiency and sustainability has become a big issue these days.
It has, and this is a lot more important. If you look, tape is by far the most efficient. And really what we're looking at here is a chart that shows a tape library and a disk system that use similar amounts of power. So that tape library is using about 700 watts. The disk NAS system is using about 750 watts. The difference is that tape library holds 10 petabytes of data, and it can transfer up to 4.8 gigabytes per second with the number of tape drives configured. That NAS system holds 880 terabytes compared to 10 petabytes, and it can only do 2 gigabytes per second. So you've got twice the throughput and about 10 to 12x the capacity in the same amount of power being used.
And that power obviously leads to CO2 emissions, and it can't escape that in the news.
Yeah, and so, tape inherently is the lowest from an overall, CO2 equivalent type of carbon footprint, in that especially a tape sitting on a shelf uses no power. It uses really hardly any cooling or anything else, to where those tapes in the library, most of them are just sitting in a slot somewhere, and you're only using power when you're actively reading or writing them in a tape drive. And you can see on this chart how much more effective that is from an environmental standpoint than any of these other storage technologies out there.
So it really brings up, from resiliency aspect, the cost, the energy, the emissions, the durability, as a kind of a no-brainer for a storage device that now is accessible as any other storage medium could be. Any closing thoughts?
No, I think that really it just ties back together. Let's try to really look at how to use all these latest and greatest technology trends. And tape fits right into that mold. So you don't have to say, I want to use cloud just because I want to use object storage or anything like that. It all falls into what's the best way to use all these technologies with on-prem Glacier, with cloud storage, and how tape can be a very large part of that for, the lowest cost, the easiest use of your data, best environmental footprint. All those pieces kind of fall back into that.
Yeah. And if you'd like to talk about specifics in your organization, please feel free to take the next step with us, which would be to reach out. We just dropped another link in the chat that will allow you to work with one of our solution architects. We can do cost analysis, architectural reviews, everything you've seen today as a tickle in this quick webinar. We can go into much greater depth on. We are a couple of minutes over. I appreciate it that everybody stayed with us. Matt, if you're game, let's take just a couple of questions here that have come in. One comment came in early. It said, tape is the future, but why is there still only one major library manufacturer, SpectraLogic, in the market? And actually, I don't want to do any call outs to our competitors, but there are a couple of tape manufacturers out there. What do you see in the tape library market? Because that's
there are, and if you look at really enterprise libraries, there's SpectraLogic and IBM provide very large enterprise systems. When you look at smaller systems, there's, Quantum still makes stuff. There's products sold by Dell, HPE. So there are other manufacturers out there. I think the big focus is that SpectraLogic, one of our real focuses is on tape still, and you won't find that anywhere else. So we have a lot of roadmap, a lot of development going on just for tape and ways to use tape better. So you look at these things like on-prem Glacier, that's a way to make tape more accessible and make it, see that ROI. And those kind of, overall systems solutions aren't going to be offered by everybody else. So that's maybe why you'd see SpectraLogic versus some of the others.
Right, with that S3 interface. A second question, do you have any comparison chart or for compression when it comes to solid state NVMe versus LTO in the latest. So what do you
I
think
think
about
some
that?
of our calculators do take into account compression, and a lot of that is really what is your data set and where is it being compressed? Is it being compressed in software? Are you using the compression, hardware compression chip on the tape drive, where an LTO drive you can get up to 2.5 to 1 compression? It's very much determined by what does your data set look like, right? If you're writing all zeros, you're going to get 2.5 to 1 compression. If you have all image files, you're probably not going to get a lot of compression because it probably got compressed as much as possible coming out of the camera type of thing. So a lot of that is really determinant on what does your data set look like.
Excellent. All right, we are going to wrap it there. We did have a question about whether there's a recording of this or whether the slide deck is available. Yes and yes. If you registered for the webinar, you will receive a copy of the recording. We will also, within about 24 hours, have that posted on our website, spectralogic.com. And we want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Matt, for being a part of this conversation. And we look forward to the next time.